Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the CSEC exam preparation session on the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and its impact on Africa. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Radhika Mahes. I am a historian by profession. And I am currently a senior lecturer in history at the College of Science, Technology, and Applied Arts of Trinidad and Tobago, that is COSTAT. This is a session for Form 5 students who will be writing CSEC Caribbean History exam this year, but I understand that there are also some Form 4 students. So welcome to all of you. I am one of the co-authors of Caribbean History for CSEC that was published in 2011. And I'm also an autism advocate. So I'm the founder and director of an NGO called Support Autism TNT. So I want to start by saying, those of you who are on social media, whether it's Instagram or Facebook, please look out for the NGO. It's an NGO that encourages youths to volunteer. So maybe you don't know, someday you all might come and volunteer with us. So it's a pleasure to meet you all online here. And I want to say thank you all for the massive response that I got to this session. I had more than 300 students registering for the session. And I am really happy to do this session with you all. Over the past few months, some students have been reaching out to me for help with various topics. And recently I did this particular topic with a couple of students who are doing my private classes. And I decided to do it and open it up to you all so everyone can start to, get an idea of the topic and start preparing for your exam. So I want to start by looking at the syllabus requirements. Well, first let me tell you the whole format of this presentation. I'll start with looking at what the syllabus asks to this particular topic. And then we will look at the reasons for the enslavement of Africans. We look at the organization of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans and look at the impact of the trade on Africa. And we'd also look at some of the experiences of the slave trade. And throughout, I will be doing revision questions, okay? So what does the syllabus ask? There's a document that was sent out recently by CSEC, by CXC. And they kind of broke down the topics that will be coming for the exam. And according to that document, for this topic, it said the triangular trade, and it said effects of the slave trade and slavery in West Africa and the Caribbean. Okay, and when you correlate that topic to what's in the syllabus, you would see that the syllabus, this particular topic comes under theme 2 in the syllabus. It comes under Caribbean economy and slavery. And the objective was to describe the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. And for content, the syllabus asks us to look at accessibility, affordability, demand, attempts to justify enslavement of Africans, and then it asks us to look at the organization and impact of the transatlantic trade and to look at the experiences of victims. Okay, so those are the specific things that the syllabus requires us to do. So let's start by looking at the context for African enslavement. Now, we call it the slave trade in brief. We call it the triangular trade. But the proper academic name is transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. So when you are writing your exam question and you're writing anything on the slave trade, and you use that, the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans, it makes you sound really, really intelligent. So use the proper name for it. Today, I will be just saying slave trade because it's very difficult to keep saying the full name, the proper official name, academic name, but I want to just tell you that when you are writing, it is the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. Okay, so we want to start by looking at the context for the trade in Africans. And when we look at the context, we are looking at the sugar revolution, we're looking at the economic factors, the fact that Africa was an attractive source for slaves. We're looking at racism, and we're looking at the religious justification for slavery. And this little diagram here kind of give you a general idea of a very quick idea of what, we're talking about. So we know that, to putting it in general context here, right? We know that the Spanish Columbus ended up in this part of the world. We know that Europeans started searching for gold and silver. We know that there was the decimation of the indigenous people through slavery and cruelty and all that. And we know that there was the change from tobacco to the cultivation of sugar, the plantation model. And there was an increased demand for sugar. And because there was an increased demand for sugar, we now needed to find laborers to work on the sugarcane plantation. So that diagram there was just give us the context, the background for it. So let's continue by looking at each one of these separately. So the first one is the sugar revolution. When we're talking about why Africans were enslaved, we have to understand what it meant by the sugar revolution. And the sugar revolution is a term that was used to describe the change from the cultivation of tobacco to the cultivation of sugarcane. There was a decline in the price of West Indian tobacco, which meant that the tobacco produced in the West Indian colonies, Trinidad and Jamaica and Barbados and so on, they could not compete with that, they couldn't compete favorably on the world market. And this led to a decline in the production of tobacco. Okay. And at the same time that was happening, there was a rise in demand for sugar in Europe, because tea was being used more and more. Previously, tea was a luxurious commodity, and it was used by the aristocracy or by the upper classes. But as tea became more widespread, you needed sugar to sweeten that tea. Okay, sugar was the sweetener for tea. So there was a rise in the demand for sugar in Europe. And this led to the large-scale cultivation of one crop. It led to the plantation economy in the British West Indies, this part of the world on the whole, in the Americas. And that large-scale cultivation of one crop is called monoculture. So we see where there was monoculture and there was a large-scale cultivation of sugarcane export. Everything that we produced here went back to Europe, to the European mother countries. And that was the stimulus for slavery. Okay? Now, the economic factors. We just talk about the change from tobacco to sugarcane. And sugarcane is a labor-intensive crop. You needed a large labor force to work on the plantations. And it was very difficult to find European slaves or servants who would actually, European or Asian, who were a productive and profitable workforce. So basically, the plantations needed a large supply of slaves to meet the demand for the production of sugar. Okay? And one of the things that we need to understand is that Africa was seen as the perfect place. It was an attractive source for slaves because it was justified, Europeans justified by saying that, the climate is more or less similar to the Americas, to the Caribbean. The diseases are almost similar. So the Africans were already immune to diseases. Africans were already accustomed to agricultural labor. Africans are physically stronger, and therefore they were seen as the ideal labor force. Okay, and to go hand in hand with that, we see where Africans were seen as backwards. They were seen in a very racist manner by Europeans. If you remember, the indigenous people were also seen as backward and uncivilized and barbaric and so on. So anyone who was not white in this period that we're talking about, anyone that was not white European was seen as barbaric and uncivilized and inferior. So Africans were considered inferior by Europeans because they were different in physical appearance. They dressed differently. They had unfamiliar cultural characteristics. And most importantly, they were not white. They were black skin. And because they were black, it therefore meant that they were seen as a backward race. And that was one of the rationalization or justification that was used to enslave them. And hand in hand with that, we have the religious factor, where Africans were not seen as native subjects of the European crowns, whether it's the British crown or the Spanish king and queen and so on. So therefore, because they were ruled by what Europeans saw as heathen and barbaric kings, they needed to be civilized, and Europeans would Christianize them and they would save their souls. Okay, and there are some passages in the Bible that were used to justify slavery. And it's interesting that we see that religious factor in the 1500s come in, 15 and 1600s come into play. Because when we reach the late 1700s and the 1800s, we see where religion was now used to argue for the end of the slave trade. So religion is the way in which religion was used at different time period is very interesting. So that was a justification for enslaving Africans. And I want to give you right away one of the revision questions, because the whole thing is to prepare you for your exam. So I am giving you 3 minutes to write down your points for this question. Just your points. Okay, so you are writing down your points. Write down the questions and write down the points. So the first one is asking for 3 reasons. Write down your 3 reasons. The second one is asking for 4 reasons. And we are going to run through it in a couple of minutes. So you have 3 minutes. I'm timing you. I would love to give you more time, but then we would never finish the topic. So it's a bit rushed, but I know you can write down some points at least. And I will be calling on you, so I want everybody to try to do it. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a second. And I am changing to gallery view so I can see all of you. Can we put on our cameras, please? Right, so we had a question in front of us that we wanted to do. Okay, and the first this is a question from paper 2, and I just want any volunteers, anybody, it doesn't matter what you have, what answer you have, okay? We are here to help each other. So anybody, I want to volunteer to read out question part A and give me 1 point that you have. Just give me 1 point. Just raise your hand. Sorry, I was going to say raise your hand. So you could go ahead, but from now, if anyone wants to volunteer, just raise your hand, okay? So yes, I'm not seeing who's talking. Hi. Just tell us your name and school, please.
My name is Jeremiah Codrington. I am from Johnson Finishing School. And
read out part A for us.
Sure. Give 3 reasons why enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean by Europeans during the 1500s. My answer was that there was no one, it was very hard to find people who could have worked on the sugarcane field.
Right. At the time. So one of the first points, 1 point that you could have for that is that it was very difficult. There was a need for a labor force. You have to justify it. First, you have to say the point. You have to be able to explain it, because one of the things I need to explain to you is when you see these questions, right? When you see a question like this and you see 3 reasons and 9 marks, it means that each one of those reasons is worth 3 marks. And it therefore means that you now need to be able to justify or explain what your answer is. Okay, so the point that you are giving me is that Africans, is it that there was a need for labor, or is it that they were the ideal labor force? What exactly is your point?
Well, that they were the ideal labor force, miss.
Right. So that's the first point. One of the reasons why Africans were enslaved is because they were seen as the ideal labor force, and you don't go on to explain it. They were seen as already experienced in agricultural labor. They were seen as acclimatized. Well, they would be able to survive the climate. They would be immune to diseases and so on. So very, very good. So you see how I have the point and then I explain it, right? So
Yes,
that's
ma'am.
what you have to do. Okay, so I want another person to give me another reason. Just raise your hands. Actually, I cannot even see when you raise your hand, so you could go ahead and just unmute yourself and give us a point. Anyone?
Oh, I will do it.
Okay, I'm seeing Rubia. Is it Rubia?
Yes.
Tell us your school, please.
Rabia Khan from Kuwait Secondary.
Okay, give me 1 point, Rubia, and explain it if you can.
Okay, they were seen as an inferior race to the whites, and this was because the whites were racist and they wanted to use a different form of humanity and make them feel like they were worth nothing, so
Okay.
they could get their own gain out of it.
Right. So the only thing you're missing there is your explanation of why they were seen as inferior. So you just have to add a couple of sentences in there saying that they were seen as inferior because they were not white and they were seen as uncivilized and barbaric and backwards and so on. And otherwise, it's well explained. Excellent point. So you all got 2 points, 2 reasons so far. I want one more reason. Anybody?
Hi, good day, Miss. My name is Safia Paul from El Dorado Secondary. And our next reason is due to the the demand for sugar in Europe. They needed cheap and a quick labor force to work on plantations, and the Africans were the easiest and cheapest way out.
Right. So the point is there was a need for labor. And to explain that point to get your 3 marks, because if you just put there's a need for labor, you're only going to get 1 mark for stating the point. So to explain it to get your full 3 marks, you will talk about the fact that there was a sugar revolution, there was a change from tobacco to sugarcane cultivation, because there was now a demand for sugar because it was used as a sweetener for tea and all the things that I just repeated that I just went through, okay? So excellent. You have 3 very good points there. So once you have those points written and explained like that, you will get your marks. Let's go on to the second one. So can someone read the question and just give me read the question and give me 1 point.
Outline 4 reasons for the increased use of African labor in the Caribbean from the 1600s to the 1800s.
Excellent. It's Jeremiah, right?
Yes, miss.
And what school are you from?
Johnson's Finishing School.
Okay, great. So tell me 1 point you have.
Oh, miss, one of my points were that they were used for African labor because of their skin color.
Yeah, because they were seen as inferior and all that. Yeah, that could work. Now, let me just go back to this question. I have to pull it back up in front of me here. So it says 4 reasons, right? And it's 16 marks. So it means that each one of those points is going to be 4 marks. Now, it didn't say why. The first question was why they were used. But the second question is why there was an increase in the use of African labor. So we can't repeat the same points. Well, we could repeat some of the points, but we have to phrase it properly now because it's saying that there's an increase. Okay, so why was there an increase? We wouldn't use back the same point with the with justifying why they were used. We need to come up with some other points now. Why was there more slaves being brought to the West Indies, to the Caribbean?
Because sugar
Sadie?
became more popular.
One, because of an increase in sugar production. And again, you'll explain why there was an increase in sugar production, which we went through just now. So you know that reason, right? Why else? I'm seeing, is it, I don't know how to pronounce your name. It's Z-X-I. Sorry, how you pronounce it?
Cheyenne.
Cheyenne. Okay, Cheyenne, tell me a point.
The sugar revolution led to an increase in the need for labor.
Okay,
That is
so
labor intensive.
yeah, so there was an increase, but well, okay, so we put in two separate points and we're using one point as the increase in sugar production, and we're saying why there's an increase in sugar production. And the next one we're going to use, which is your point, we're going to change it around and say there was a demand for labor. Okay, so the second point is there's a demand for labor. I am seeing Lexi.
My point was that Africans were often killed or run away, so they had to be replaced and imported frequently to replace to those that, yeah.
That is an excellent point. So because there was a high mortality rate amongst the slave population in the Caribbean, there was a need to constantly import slaves, not even import, ship slaves, import some to civilize. There was a constant need to ship more and more slaves to replace those who were who had died or had been killed. Very good. Let me see. Who am I seeing? Yeah.
Miss, because they.
Sorry, give me your
easy
name
to
and your
control.
school. Name and school.
Danica, St. John, St. Francis College.
Okay, tell me one more. We had 3 so far. We want one more.
Because they were easier to control because they didn't look like the Europeans. They couldn't run away or hide in crowds, so they were easier to control.
Yes, excellent point. So there was an increase in the shipment of slaves because it was easier to control them. And nobody told me one of the main points, which is it was free labor. It was slave labor, which means that it did not cost the plantation much in terms of cost of production because they did not have to pay for the labor. Okay, then I'm just going to add some others for you to jot down quickly. One, the European indented servants, that whole scheme was unsuccessful. So therefore they kept increasing the shipment of slaves from Africa. Another one that you could also put is that because they didn't have, well, this goes hand in hand actually, they did not have any other alternative farm labor force. So I think you have more than 4 there, right? I want to move on because we have some other questions, other things that we want to do. So I'm going to move on and let's continue. I'm going to share my screen again. Very good. You all did well. I just want you to understand that when you see a question with 3 points and is 9 marks, you have to explain it. If you just give the points, you're not going to get the full mark for it. Okay, you have to actually explain it. And if you see it's 4 marks, it means that you have a little more explanation to do. Okay, so let's continue. Very good so far. Okay, so next thing is how was the slave trade organized? Okay, and when we're talking about how the slave trade was organized, we're looking at how slaves were obtained. We're looking at the goods that were traded. We're looking at the treatment of slaves, and we're looking at the middle passage. So those are some of the things that we have to be able to go through. I'm just going to show you a very, very short video. Oops, oops, oops.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy. The Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean. But the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
And that short video gave you almost all the points that we are going to run through from now. So let's talk about the structure of this slave trade. It's called a triangular trade, because it encompasses 3 continents. It encompasses the Americas, North America, Central America, North America, South America, and well, the Caribbean area. That's the whole of the American continent. It involved the African continent, and it involved the European continent. So that's why it's called a triangular trade. Okay, so we have to look at how each one of those was involved in the slave trade. And this is another map showing you Europe, Africa, and the West Indies, Europe, Africa, and the Caribbean. Okay, and this one outlines some of the cities that we're talking about. So in Africa, we're talking about places, countries. We're talking about places like Senegal, Sierra Leone, the Congo, Angola, and so on. In the Caribbean, we're talking about most of the Caribbean countries, the British West Indies, or the British Caribbean, as well as the French colonies, Martinique and Guadeloupe. We're talking about the Dutch colonies, Suriname, Aruba, Curacao, and so on. We're talking about the Spanish colonies. Cuba was Spain's richest Spanish colony and one of the biggest producer of sugarcane in this part of the world. And of course, there's Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony and one of the biggest producer of sugarcane in this part of the world, and one of Portugal's richest colony. So we're talking about 3 continents involving many countries. Okay, and that is one of the things that have made the slave trade, the African slave trade, such a massive venture, because it wasn't just one country involved, it was so many European countries. You had the Portuguese, you had the Dutch, you had the French, you had the Spanish, you had the British. They were all involved in the slave trade. When we're talking about the different branches, as I said, it's referred to as the triangular trade. And from Europe, so if someone wanted to trade in slave, if, for example, I was a merchant living in Britain and I wanted to trade in slaves, I wanted to invest money in the slave trade. I wanted to become involved in the slave trade because I know that I am going to get a high profit from it. The first thing that I will have to do is I will have to make sure that, you know, I can invest in a ship and I can outfit that ship with all the things that is needed to go to Africa. So I will have to make sure that that ship have everything. It has a ship captain. I hire a captain. I make sure that I have a crew. The captain will get his crew, and then they will have all the things that they need to control the slaves on board the ship when they reach Africa and they pick up the slaves. So things like guns and ammunition, things like chains that they would use as shackles, all those things they will outfit their ship with in Europe. Whether it's if they're leaving from England, they might leave from the port of Liverpool or Bristol or Manchester. And once that ship is outfitted, they would also put enough food stuff on that ship to last them, and they will put items that they will take with them to Africa that they will use to trade for slaves. Okay, so things like manufactured goods, guns, cloth, iron, all those things went from Europe to Africa. The main commodity from Africa to the West Indies was the enslaved Africans. So on the journey from Africa to the West Indies, that was called the Middle Passage. And on that Middle Passage, it was a human cargo. Okay, so the ship was packed with human cargo or Africans. Then when they reached the West Indies, they will offload their human cargo and they would stock their ship with all the things that were being produced in the West Indian colonies. The most important one, of course, was sugar. And then in addition to sugar, you had things like molasses. You had, other countries had tobacco, coffee, rice, and so on. Rum, of course, was also a very important product. And they would pack up that in their boats in the West Indies and they would head back to Europe. And then they would make the whole journey all over again. So that is why it's called the triangular trade. Okay, and I'm going to go into more depth on it. So I just give you a general run through on how the slave trade was structured from Europe to Africa to the Americas, back to Europe. Now, again, I'm a British merchant. I have hired I bought a ship and I've got a slave captain and a ship captain and I have, a crew and I'm sending them to Africa. I wouldn't just send them to Africa. I would have somebody in Africa who is responsible for making sure that I have enough slaves to fill that ship. And that person was called a slave trader. So the slave trader would have been residing in Africa and he would be the one responsible for getting the slaves. So slaves were obtained in different ways. Slaves were kidnapped through slave raids. So the slave trader, if it's the British slave trade, it would be a British person, a British slave trader. He would be living there and he would hire persons, they were referred to as African middlemen, to go into the interiors, to go into the villages and different communities, tribal communities, to capture people. So slaves were obtained by capturing them through slave raids. Slaves were obtained by purchasing prisoners of war. So Africa had many tribes, thousands of tribes, and there were always tribal wars. And when the tribe was victorious, they will take prisoners of wars. When the Europeans started trading they started getting involved in the slave trade, they realized that they could pay these tribal leaders in guns and ammunition and so on for slaves, because a tribal leader would be very happy to get guns and ammunition, because it meant that when next he went to war with another tribe, he would be more powerful. They would be able to defeat them. Okay, so some slaves were obtained as prisoners of wars. There was another case where some Africans were enslaved as punishment for crimes. And again, once the Europeans started trading, they started purchasing all those slaves. And the same thing with poverty. Those poor parents who could not take care of their children and had sold them as slaves to the tribal leaders started selling them because they wanted things like guns and ammunition. They wanted things like pots and utensils, glass beads, and all those things. It made them powerful. It made them look more regal when compared to the other tribes. So those are some of the ways in which slaves were obtained. Now, once, for example, if there was a slave raid and the slave trader along with the African middlemen went into the interiors and they captured an entire village or an entire tribe, they would chain them together, or they would shackle them. Okay, that's where they were chained from their ankles and at their necks. And they would be shackled and they would now be moved from the interior areas to the coastal areas, because remember the slave ship is going to come to the coastal areas to pick them up, to stock up. So they would be forced to move from that coastal area to from the interior to the coastal area. And they were made to walk. Everyone, women and children, were not excluded from that. And sometimes that journey could take as much as 100 days. So there was a very high mortality rate from that time because many of them did not survive that journey. Okay, and they would be made to walk to the coastal areas where they would be kept in slave houses. Now, you're not going to get 500 slaves come into the coastal area in one day to fill a ship. They're going to be coming little by little until you have enough to fill a ship. So they would be kept at these slave houses. They were also called barracoons or slave forts. And they were normally very large structures with massive walls around them. The walls were there to withstand attacks from Africans who were coming to help those who were enslaved escape, as well as to prevent the escape of slaves. Okay, they were separated. So men, women, and children were kept in separate rooms. And they would stay at these slave forts until there was sufficient numbers to fill a ship. To give you an idea of what some of those forts look like, the barracoons, this one was not used for the British slave trade. It was used for the Portuguese slave trade. It is located in a place called Badagry in Nigeria. Okay, and it was used to transport slaves from Badagry, Nigeria to Brazil. So many of the slaves who were transported to Brazil, later on, they came through this slave port, this barracoon. This is an idea of the different rooms that they had. As I said, men, women, and children were separated. And any one of those rooms, they would cram as much as 70 to 80 slaves, adult slaves. They used the shackles a lot. So slaves were always kept shackled. So they use nails, for example, to keep the shackles together, to keep the chains together. So that's a good example of one of the industries that developed in Britain later on, in Europe later on, iron industry. This was something that they would fill with water. This was a vessel that they would fill with water, and if the slave was thirsty, they would have to drink from this. And at this point, I want to get you to understand that slaves, African slaves, were never seen as human beings. They were seen as property, and they were never considered as human beings. So therefore, the entire experience of slavery was a very dehumanizing experience. Okay, these are Brandon irons, Brandon rods. So the slaves would be branded when they reached the slave ports. If they were managed to escape and they were recaptured, they would know which slave port they belonged to. Okay, so they would be branded upon capture. These are ideas of the chains that were used as shackles. So they were always kept shackles. There was a lot of emphasis on making sure that they do not escape, because every single slave that they got would be sold for a price in the West Indies. And it was very important to make sure that they bring a full shipload of slaves. This is another example of a slave port. This one is located on a place called Gorée Island in Senegal. Gorée Island is 20 minutes off the coast of Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal. And the upstairs part that you see in there was where the slave trader would live. So the slave trader would live there. That is the British slave trader, the European slave trader, the white man. He would live there, and he would live in very luxurious surroundings. So he would have huge dining rooms and kitchen and living room quarters and bedrooms and so on. And downstairs is where the slaves were kept. So these rooms are where the slaves were kept. And again, they were separated. Men, women, and children were placed in separate rooms. For this particular slave, for many of them actually, they were built in such a way that the ship would come up right outside. So they were made to walk down the corridor through that door on board the ship. And the reason for that is, again, to prevent escape of to prevent the slaves from escaping. That door was called the door of no return, because they knew that once they walked through that door, there was no possibility of them returning to Africa, okay, to their motherland. So they would be shackled and they will be shepherded along this corridor straight onto the ship. Right outside there's deep water. So if they try to escape, they might very well fall into that deep water. So it was very, very difficult for them to escape. And everything was done to make sure that they had enough slaves to put on that ship. This is a slave port that was located in Ghana. Okay, let's continue. So once they got on that ship, they were transported to the Caribbean. Okay, and that journey is called the Middle Passage. And the main commodity, as I mentioned earlier, was the enslaved Africans. They would also have things like indigo and different plants and animals and so on, but the main commodity was enslaved Africans. So every single part of the ship was filled with enslaved Africans, with human cargo. This is a cross-sectional representation of the ship, and you can see that all the spaces were used to make sure that they had as much slaves on board that ship as possible. So the ship captain would use two methods of packing the slaves. One was called loose packing and one was called tight packing. And the idea of loose packing was that if, The slave captain wants to make sure that he have 500 slaves arriving alive in the Caribbean. So he might decide, well, I'm not going to stuff them together. I'm going to give them a little bit of room so that they wouldn't have a high mortality rate. That was one way of thinking, and it was all dependent on the individual captain. The other way of thinking was tight packing, which was based on the assumption that you're going to lose 20% of your cargo anyway. 20% of the slaves are going to die anyway. So therefore, you pack 20% extra to make sure that you have the numbers that you need when you arrive in the Caribbean. The issue with the Middle Passage and with that whole idea of transporting a human cargo is that cargo wasn't really treated as human. They were always treated in a very dehumanizing manner. They were always kept shackled. They were only allowed on deck once a week to exercise, just to make sure that they remain, relatively healthy and they could survive the journey. They didn't have any kind of toilet facilities or anything. Sometimes a slave might die and the body will stay right there amongst all the others for days before it was thrown aboard. And as a result, we see that there was a high mortality rate during the Middle Passage because of the unsanitary conditions during the Middle Passage. Okay, it was a very unsanitary slave ship that came to the Caribbean, and many slaves die from diseases. Okay, the average length of the voyage was usually 50 days on a good voyage. Sometimes it will go much more than that. As I said, there was a high mortality rate, and the death rate increased rapidly the longer that they were taken to reach the Caribbean. Okay, this is our second revision question then. So I'm giving you a couple of minutes. You have 3 parts, A, B, and C, and it comes up to a total of 25 marks. So I'm giving you 5 minutes, and I'm gonna do what I just did, open back up the floor for you all to give me your answers. Okay, so 5 minutes. Okay, so let's hear some answers. This is such a simple, easy, straightforward question. Anybody just raise your hand and read out the question for me and tell me what answer you have. A, part 1, anyone? I didn't see no hands yet. We should be rushing to answer this. This is easy. Anybody? Do I have to pick on you all? Vivek.
Can you put the question, please?
Sorry?
Can you put back up the question, please?
So name 2 English ports that were involved in the transatlantic trade. I mentioned it when I was speaking. Who's going to tell me 2? Just say your name and your school, please.
Right, Vivek Ramdan from Aja Boys College.
Right.
Well, 2 are the ports the port in Bristol and the port in Liverpool.
Yeah, Liverpool, Bristol. You could also have Manchester. You could have London as well. So any one of those. Next question. Name 2 West African places. Can you mute your mic, please? Maya. Okay, name 2 West. My host muted all of us. Okay, name 2 West African places from which captives were obtained. Another easy question. Who's answering this one for me? I showed you. Name and school.
Safia Paul again, El Dorado East. And
Yeah.
2 West African places is Nigeria and the Ivory Coast.
Yep, well, you can have
Yes.
so many that you could have for that. Thank you so much. Okay, part B. Outline 3 ways in which captives were obtained in Africa for the transatlantic trade in captive Africans. I listed all the ways before. Name and school.
My name is Shirika Dickerson. I'm from Johnson Finishing School. And the African chiefs and warriors supplied slaves. Supply slaves to sell them and gain supplies.
Yeah. So, sorry, they were supplied by who?
The African chiefs and warriors.
Right. So that's one point. They were supplied. The slaves were obtained by bartering with African tribal leaders. That's one. Somebody give me another way in which slaves were obtained. Tell me your name and school, okay?
I'm Delano Smith. I'm from St. James Secondary. And another way they obtain captives was by African empires, which purposefully engage in raids of small villages, and they obtain slaves, which were criminals, to be sold off as, well, not sold off.
As slaves.
I should have
To be
put
sold as slaves.
battered
Yeah.
for goods and things like that.
Okay, it's Delano, right?
Yes, miss.
Right. So Delano just give us 2. So the 3 ways you would have is 1, true slave raids, and you will explain how they actually went into the villages and interiors of African countries and they raided entire villages and captured everyone, men, women, and children. That's 1. 2, by tribal leaders selling off slaves in return for arms and ammunition and glass beads and silk and other textile and so on. And the 3rd one was prisoners of wars. And you explained that because remember, for this question is 3 ways and it's for 9 marks. So that means that you have to be able to explain each one to get your 3 marks each. If you just list the 3 ways, you will just get 3 marks. You have to explain each one. So it's very important when you're answering questions in paper 2 that you look at the distribution of marks for each question and each part of the question. Okay, and that together was 13 marks there. So simple, easy way to get your marks when questions come like this. There's nothing there that we haven't spoken about. Okay, I'm gonna continue. There's another question. So I'm giving you 3 minutes to do this one because you have to actually read that little thing. Now that is very difficult, but 3 minutes. Let me pause my recording. Okay, so let's see. Can someone read that letter extract for us, please?
Sure, no problem.
Name and school.
Andreline from Valencia Secondary. Imagine that you are an Englishman living in Liverpool in the 1700s. You are having a conversation with your son about the slave trading voyages which you organized to West Africa and the Caribbean. Answer the following questions which he asks you.
Okay, tell me answer. Read out A and tell me 1. Tell me what you have then.
A, what steps do you take in England before the beginning of a slave trading voyage? Well, the first step they may take is how much persons they may be accounting for. They may calculate how much individuals they plan to take captive. To on board the ship.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you are a merchant in England and you want to start the slave trading, right? What do you do? What is the first thing you have to get?
Miss, I have to get permission
from
the Queen
Yeah, so you have to get a license. And actually, I didn't mention that because that's a whole different section. But yes, so you need to get a license to trade in slave. Then you get your, what is the next step? Anyone?
Missing a slave trade boat.
You get your ship or you get so if you're very, very rich, right? You're not going to do all this yourself. If you're an extremely rich merchant, you wouldn't do it yourself. You might hire somebody to do all this for you. But basically, if you get your license, the next step is to get your ship, get the ship outfitted, get a crew. What else you doing with that ship to make sure that it's ready to go on a voyage?
Miss ensure, or Miss Canna from St. Andreas for Girls in Jamaica, you'd ensure that the ship is sturdy enough to go through the waters in the sea, so it won't turn over and stuff like that.
Yeah, so we know that we want a good, proper working ship. What goes on board that ship, more importantly?
All the things to trade.
All the things to trade. So what are the things to trade that we're talking about?
The human cargo.
No. The human.
You need
Manufactured
manufactured
goods.
Ammunition.
The manufactured goods.
Hi, Miss Shania from
Okay, we all going at the same time, so everybody's talking at the same time. So this is not working. So let me call some names. Brianna, what are you putting on that ship? Remember, it is from Europe to Africa, so not the human cargo yet. The human cargo is from Africa, okay? So what is going from Europe, Brianna?
Hi, Miss. My name is Brianna Beal, and I'm from Barbados Secondary School. And on the ship, it will be the stuff that they are trading, like the manufactured goods and textiles and guns.
Right, I need you to list them. So remember again, this question is for how many marks? Is right. So you need to list it exactly. So you need to say 1, get a license, 2, get a ship, 3, outfit the ship. What are we outfitting the ship with? 1, we outfitting the ship with all the manufactured goods that we are now going to trade for slaves in Africa. So Kamel, can you list some of those goods specifically for me, please? I can barely hear you.
Are you hearing me better now?
Yeah, I'm hearing you good now.
Okay. I have that they would have guns, they would have ammunition, they would have also they also have things that they think that the tribal leaders would see as valuable, like you said, glass beads and things like that to trade. To also things help them with their tribal laws that they would hold valuable.
Right, very good. So they'll have all their stocks to trade, and then they will have all the things that they need to control the slaves. So what would some of those be? Is it Verily Webb? Your hand is up. What would some of those things be?
That they will need to. Can you repeat the question for me, please?
What? So in addition to having all the things that they need to trade, right? They also need to have things to control the slaves when they pick them up. So what are some of the things that they would have to control the slaves? We mentioned guns and ammunition. What else?
They will need the shackles, the chains for them.
So they need all their weapons and all their chain. So that
and
would
they
be
need food.
Yes, and food. So very good. So that would be the things that we're looking for. Okay, so let's run through this step quickly again. You want to get involved in the trade. The first thing is you get the license to trade in slaves. The second thing is you hire a merchant to do all the business for you, or you decide to do it yourself. If you're doing it yourself, you will first need to get a ship. And the second thing is you need to outfit that ship. You're outfitting that ship with 2 different sets of things. 1, the items that you need to keep your slaves under control on the journey from Africa to the Caribbean. And those would be things like arms, ammunition, shackles, and so on. And the second one is the items that you are going to trade. So all the manufactured goods, cloth, textile, pots and pans and so on. So very good. The next part B, can someone who has their hand up, someone read part B for me and give me 1 point? Cameron.
Good day, miss. Miss, I can't see the question. I didn't write it down. I just write down the answer.
Okay, let me just share the screen again then. Right, so there you go.
My name is Cameron Briggs from El Dorado East Secondary.
Actually, sorry, Cameron, is part C, right? We will go back to part B after.
Explain why so many slaves died during the voyage from Africa to the Caribbean.
Give me one.
Many slaves died because of illnesses.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say illnesses. I will say because of the prevalence of diseases. Okay, and you will list them. Things like chicken pox and smallpox and malaria and all kind of dysentery and diarrhea and all those things. And you could link diseases to the unsanitary conditions, or you could have unsanitary conditions as your second point. Now, you notice for this question, they didn't say list 3 ways in which slaves die, right? They just have explain why so many slaves die, but it's for 10 marks. So it means that when you get a question like that and you just have, it doesn't tell you how many points you need to have, but it's a large chunk of marks. It's 10 marks. It means that you need to give at least 3 or 4 points and you need to explain it. And in this case, all those points can run into each other. So when you tell me because of the prevalence of diseases, you can go on to explain that and say there's a high, the slave ships, many of the slaves die from diseases because the slave ships were very unsanitary and they were breeding ground for diseases. And you go on to talk about why it was unsanitary, the fact that they were chained together. They sometimes someone might die and they will be right there for days before the body was removed. They had no kind of toilet facilities or anything. So all those can go together with diseases. You can also link malnutrition to diseases as well. The fact that because they were not getting the kind of nutrients, they became more susceptible to diseases on board the slave ship. Okay, so when you get a question like that, as I said, without telling you how many points, look at the marks. If it's 10 marks, it means that you have to write something substantial to get that 10 marks. You just can't list 2 or 3 points. You have to explain it. You have to say exactly what it is that happened. Okay. In addition to diseases and unsanitary conditions, we could also mention things like many of them committed suicide. Some of them were killed when they resisted on board the ships. So anything along those lines, but let the mark be used as an indicator of how much you have to write for it. Okay, I want to go on because I have one more section that I want to do with you. So let's continue. Okay, so the impact of the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans. We need to understand how this trade affected or impacted on Africa.
Four. What effects did the slave trade have on Africa? Answer. The slave trade had many effects on Africa. Most of them were, of course, negative, though we can argue that the slave trade was beneficial for some African states in the short term. One negative about the slave trade was that it tended to increase the amount of war that occurred in West Africa. The reason for this is that European and American slave traders did not simply go out into the African countryside and kidnap their own slaves. Instead, they bought slaves from the coastal kingdoms. Those kingdoms generally got slaves to sell through war and through raids against inland tribes. Because the slave traders wanted more slaves, the coastal kingdoms were encouraged to wage more wars and conduct more raids against their neighbors. In addition, those kingdoms were provided with things like guns in exchange for slaves. This helped those kingdoms have a greater capacity for waging war. This brings us to the one short-term benefit of the slave trade. It initially helped the coastal kingdoms. Those kingdoms became
Okay, I don't think you were seeing the video for some reason. Were you seeing it?
Yes,
Yes,
miss.
miss.
Oh, sorry. Because,
It was
okay,
clear and audible.
Okay, I'm just going to go back to it then. And actually, you know what? I will send you the link to the video and you could look at it. Let us go on to let us go on to the points. Right. So when we're talking about the impact on Africa, we're talking about one, the economic impact. And the first thing under economic impact is depopulation. The fact that approximately 20 million Africans were taken as slaves. Now, out of that 20 million, there was a very high mortality rate, so many did not arrive alive in the Caribbean. But the fact is, even if they did not survive, a large percentage of the population were enslaved. And that meant that there was depopulation in Africa. Okay, so that is the first thing. The second thing is depopulation is linked very closely to the loss of human resources. Because when you are taking people, when you're taking Africans, who is there to stay back and work, who is there to cultivate the crops and so on. And worse yet, when you are taking the physically strong ones. So initially when slavery started, they would target the extremely strong tribes, or those communities that were seen as physically fit. But then later on, by the 1700s, when slaves were so much in demand, they started raiding the tribes and taking anyone, because everyone was sold at a price. So once you took people, and in some cases, entire tribes were captured. So you had a loss of human resources. What does that mean? The implication of that? There was a resultant labor problem because you didn't have people remaining to work as laborers. Then in addition to that, Africa never really got a chance to industrialize because you are depopulating and you are taking away human resource. So it stunted the growth of industries in Africa. And at the same time, you had the rise of African middlemen. Those were the ones who I mentioned who were hired by the slave trader to go into the interiors and capture the slaves and so on. And I'll give you a good example of African middlemen. I showed you a picture of the slave port in Gorée Island. And I told you that Gorée Island is located 20 minutes off the coast of Senegal, off the coast of Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal. To get from the mainland, Dakar, to Gorée Island, they depended on canoemen, on African canoemen who knew how to navigate the water. So they depended on them to transport the slaves from the mainland to the slave port on Gorée Island. And that very small group of skilled canoemen, they became really, really rich from the slave trade because they were paid high amounts to transport the slaves. And what we see as a result is that there was a massive gap in wealth in Africa. And that is something that we see in Africa even till today. So the impact of the slave trade on Africa is very, it's lasting. We still see some parts of it evident even till today. Then we had the social impact. When we talk about the social impact, we're talking about disintegration of families. We're talking about loss of villages, entire villages and communities. We're talking about increase in tribal wars. And of course, there was a rise of racism that exists even till today, where Africans are perceived as inferior. So we cannot underestimate the impact of the slave trade on Africa, economically and socially. At the same time that we're talking, could you save your questions for the end, please? At the same time where we're talking
about the slide of minutes, please.
What's that? Could you repeat? You want me to go back to the slide, to this one? Okay. So the second thing is when we also have to look at the impact of the slave trade on European countries. And when we're talking about the impact on European countries, we're talking about the rise of industries, which is the opposite of what we saw for Africa. Okay, so all those materials that they needed to take to trade for slaves or to barter for slaves in Africa, there was a rise in all those industries. Let's start with shipbuilding. When we spoke about the person, the European person, the British person who just wanted to get involved in trading in slaves, the first thing is he needs to look for a ship, whether he buys a ship or whether he hires a ship. So there was an increase in the shipbuilding industries. There was an increase in iron industry, in the production of chains, for example, that were used for shackles. There was an increase in the production of guns and ammunition. So all these industries developed rapidly because of the slave trade. You had an increase in textile production, cotton, for example. Silk was still being brought, still traded from Persia and from India, but the cotton industry expanded immensely during this period that we're talking about in Britain. Also industries that produce glass beads and pots and utensils, all those industries developed. So Britain, European countries on the whole, were able to benefit economically from the slave trade, and they were able to industrialize. At the same time, we see the development of coastal cities such as Liverpool and Bristol and Manchester. All of those coastal areas developed into huge cities. And there was a very thriving slave trade economy in those cities, the production of goods and services, the ships were coming in and out, everything that was needed to keep those ships running. So when we talk about the impact of European countries, we're seeing many positive impact. When we talk about the impact on African countries, we're seeing the negative impact. Okay. Okay, I'm going to go to another question. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to do this one. So write on your points. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to continue because you notice by now that the questions are repeating themselves, right? That they're coming more or less in the same way and they're asking for the same information. And I will use this opportunity to tell you to keep doing past paper questions, because you would find that the more questions you do, the more you'd be able to revise. And when you do a question, if you can't answer it, you go back to your textbook and you find the information. But I want to continue. I want to finish off this question. So I need a volunteer to read this for me. Someone who I haven't heard from so far. Who is there? I am seeing, is it Z Roberto? Did I pronounce the name correctly?
Miss, it's Zero Berto. But it's all right.
Okay, what school are you at?
I'm from Excelsior High School in Jamaica.
Okay, can you read that for us, please?
Okay, Miss. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would I would have freely parted with them all, all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country.
Okay, so part A, read it and tell me what you have.
Miss,
Yeah.
I only have one so far, and that is that in some cases that children were born into slavery because their parents themselves were slaves.
Did you join the session late by any chance?
Yes, miss.
Yeah, I saw that. I don't know if it was because of the difference in time, but I saw a lot of you who were coming in an hour later. And I have a strange feeling it was the difference in time. But when I post the recording, I'll post this recording as soon as we finish. I'll post it on my YouTube channel so you can access it there and you will get all the different ways. Okay, so let me call on someone else who was here from the beginning, who can answer, who could give me some more ways. I have, is it Tamia? Did I pronounce it correctly?
Tamaya, yeah.
Tamaya. Go ahead. 4 ways.
Tamaya from SJC, St. Joseph Convent, yeah. They were captured as prisoners of war.
So they were captured as prisoners of war. Give me all Tamaya because we went through it already. We're here all the time. We just did a question with the same thing.
Right. Raids.
Slave raids.
Slave raids.
Prisoners of wars.
That's, yeah.
Okay, that's 2. Very good, Tamaya. Let me hear from someone else. Who didn't answer so far? Adon, is it Adon?
Yeah, miss.
All right, give me 2 more.
Due to a punishment for some crime.
Punishment of crimes, and 1 more.
And they were sold by African merchants or rulers.
Yeah, so any one of those, you can also mention those who were, we mentioned prisoner of wars. Okay, so you got the 4, let's list them again. True slave raids, as prisoners of wars. What were the others we said? Tamaya, what you told me just now? We did this just now, you know, somebody, anybody, you. Let's all 4 for us.
Miss, they were captured in raids. They
Uh-huh.
were prisoner.
Prisoner
They
of
were
war.
also punishment for crime
Punishment.
and because of poverty.
Excellent. So those were your 4. Okay. And as I said, it's there from when we spoke before. Thank you very much. Let's continue. Explain 3 ways in which the transatlantic trade in enslaved Africans had a negative effect on West African societies. 9 marks. So 3 ways, 3 marks each. So you need to explain whatever point you give in. So let's see, any volunteers for this? Shadika.
Hi, Shadika, secretary from Transportation School. The continuous exploitation caused the continuous exploitation of Africans. It Europeans took away many young Africans, young and strong Africans, and this resulted in the lack of activity and growth in the African economy.
Okay, so let me tell you, it's an excellent point, right? But let me tell you how to lead with that point. Make the point and then explain it. So start off by saying that there was a decline of growth of the African economy because, and then go on to explain it. You understand? So it's everything that you have, but you state in the point and then you explain in the point. So that's very good. Rubia, give me one. Give me a next one.
Okay. So Africa was faced with severe depopulation because its citizens were taken away, man, woman, and child.
Children. Men, women, and children. So that's very good. Thank you. Next one is who do we have? Brianna?
Yes, miss. There was a labor shortages because of the heavy amount of slaves that were being taken, of Africans that were being taken.
Okay, so let's rephrase that possibly. Let's start off by saying that there was there was a serious labor shortage in Africa because of the large numbers of persons who were enslaved as and taken to the Caribbean. Okay, and then you go on to explain that, for example, in some cases, entire tribes were taken away, or the healthiest persons were taken away, and therefore you didn't have anybody to continue working agriculture and so on. So list it like that. Now, one of the first points that I would want you, if I was your examiner, right, marking this question, one of the first point that I would expect to see is depopulation. The depopulation point that I gave you, the fact that such a large number, approximately 20 million Africans were captured, were taken as slave, and meant that there was a depopulation of African countries. So you see all those points we went through before. I need you all to go through them again. So even when we finish this session just now, I want you to go back and go through this session, because remember, this is one of the topics that they have shortlisted for the exam. So, and the questions can only come in very specific ways. And you would see that the questions tend to repeat themselves. It is a topic that is very nice and very straightforward, and one that you could handle very well in an exam, but you need to revise what we have done. Okay, let's run through part C. Examine 3 of the conditions on board a slaver. A slaver refers to a slave ship. Okay, I didn't use the word when I was talking, so make a note of that. On board a slaver, which might have made Equiano want to trade places with the meanest slave in his own country. So what were the conditions on board the ship that would make him want to definitely not be there? I'm seeing Zalika or Zalaika?
Hi, Miss. Yeah, Zalika.
Okay.
Zalika from Asha Girls College, Tunapuna. Miss, they were ill-treated and they were too small, malnourished.
Right. So don't simply say they were ill-treated alone. Remember, it's 3 conditions and it's 12 marks. So that means 4 marks each. So don't simply say they were ill-treated. Simply put it in another way. You want to emphasize the poor conditions on board the slaves that would want him to not ever be on that ship, right? So you want to say that slaves were treated in a dehumanizing manner. And then you explain what you mean like that. They were not seen as humans. They were just seen as cargo. They were just seen as a way to make money. They would have to stay on filthy conditions, and you expand on that. So the first point is the dehumanizing conditions on board the ship. Okay, you understand how I change it up to make your answer stronger, to make your point come out stronger. Okay, so that's one. The second, let's continue. Cheyenne, give me another point. Cheyenne, you there? I see your hand raised, but you're muted. Okay, while how about, who else hands is raised? Sophia.
It's on mute now. It wasn't allowing me to unmute before.
Okay, good. Cheyenne, go ahead.
The fact that they were flogged and whipped on the ship. So
yeah. So the second point is that they were treated in a very vicious manner. They were flogged and whipped for any incident or if they tried to resist. and many of them die because of punishment, severe punishment on the slave ship. So that's very good. And next point, Maya. Maya muted. Right, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Maya Francois and I'm from Animal Central Secondary. My point is that he had to witness the death of many Africans because of the unsanitary conditions that we had experienced.
Right. So, and again, you explain it. He did not want to be on that ship. It was the last place he wanted to be because he had to witness the death of his fellow Americans. And then you explain how they die. Many of them die from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions. Many of them die from dehydration and starvation. Many of them die when they try to resist it. And again, the point, so you have 3 good points there, but the point I am trying to make to you is that if you want to get your full marks for these questions, you have to expand when you see 3 points for 12 marks, because it means that the examiner is looking for you to make the point and explain the point. Okay, and if you don't explain the point and you just list the point, you are not going to get your marks, your full marks for it. You will not get the full marks. So remember, for the exam, the whole idea is that you answer questions in such a way that you score as much marks as possible. Okay, let's see what comes next. Okay, I think that is the end of that session. So let me okay, I know that many of you have been asking questions in the chat. I want to start by saying that this session is being recorded and I will post this recording in the YouTube channel as soon as it's finished. In fact, I'm going to stop recording